Why is the right so bad at culture? This week, Chris Bayliss and I talk about the slow decline of culture on the right and what we need to do to renew it. Welcome to The Critic. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Critic Video Podcast, and I'm again joined, thank God, by Chris Bayliss. Chris, how are you?
I'm very well indeed, thank you, sir. How are you?
Yeah, not bad, not bad. And today we're going to talk about a piece by Lola Salem called Renewing Culture for the Right. And I just want to start by reading you the opening quote from this, which is, "Cultural change is never only about winning the argument, but about making people desire to side with you." Given the centrality, therefore, of culture, why is the right so bad at it?
I think the right's lost its way very slowly over many decades, and probably over more than a century. I think historically, well, it almost goes back as far as there has been a right and a left.
Yeah.
I think historically we would identify, most conservative, with a small c, minded people would identify with the values of high art from the 18th and 19th centuries. Certainly, I don't think any of that was going on in a consciously political manner. I think the idea of beauty and the idea of the principles of civilization, as the likes of Kenneth Clark talked about it. I think that over the course of the 20th century, and particularly the late 20th century, art changed in terms of its social status. Yeah. A lot of the mass forms of art in the late 19th, early 20th centuries were considered a bit seedy and slightly disreputable, and certainly television and radio, when it first emerged in the cinema, acting always has been a slightly sort of raunchy profession. And I think over the course of the 20th century, that changed. And I think what you saw was a lack of variety creeping in terms of the kind of people who were drawn into it. I think in earlier parts of the last century, there were an awful lot more people getting into the arts from, I think, more humble backgrounds than you see today. And they brought with them, I think, a greater degree of variety in terms of their perspectives. And what has happened, I think, over the years is that there's been an encroaching orthodoxy, and it's certainly not a right-wing orthodoxy. It's a progressive orthodoxy in terms of the people that are around. And I think it's this commitment to a lack of interest in getting involved in the politics behind it. I think I've seen a lot of conservatives stepping away from that kind of the institutional architecture behind the arts.
So do you think it's essentially, do you think it's the kind of development of mass media? Do you think that has hived off those conservatives, or do you think it's essentially ossified conservatives? And because it is a mass format, it's kind of turned a lot of conservatives off. And you mentioned them, in the 18th and 19th century being very committed to particular high art ideals of that period. I would say that conservatives are very much still there. So things like opera, ballet, traditional art, I would say, is still very much a conservative interest. So why do you think those people have fallen away? Or do you think that they haven't fallen away and they've just become ossified, and it's the mass media that they're not participating?
I think conservatives have got out of, and perhaps to some extent never got into, thinking of those things as political in any way, really. I think there are plenty of conservative opera lovers, there are conservative theatre goers, but they don't appear to want to see their own politics necessarily reflected back on them. I think go to any conservative household and you'll find bookshelves groaning under the weight of overtly left-wing writers and authors. I mean, think of the theatre, for example. Mm-hmm. Are there any conservative playwrights in modern Britain? The only one I can sort of think of is Tom Stoppard, who I think might be a conservative, but I only think that because he doesn't really talk about politics.
Yeah. The absence of politics is almost makes you
there's something
inherently conservative.
And I think there's almost something subversive about the absence of politics in a lot of art these days.
Yes.
And
certainly artists, I can only think of Gilbert and George.
Yeah,
actually, Emin is a Tory now, isn't she? But she wasn't when she was making.
Has she come out? I don't think Emin's come out with a great deal recent. When did she last sort of make any?
Oh God, I couldn't tell you.
But to some extent,
I'm conservative. I don't take no interest in modern art.
I think that to some extent you get somebody like Tracy Emin, who, I mean, she's a provocateur.
Yeah,
and coming out identifying as a conservative or just doing anything to sort of indicate that you might be that way inclined is a provocative thing to do in the world of the arts these days.
So I think she's more a contrarian than a conservative.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of almost reminded of didn't Kate Bush come out as a fan of Theresa May? And it was just this. It's people come out with. It's the sort of thing that there's nothing vaguely newsworthy about it, but the fact that you get an artist sort of even hinting at it seems so remarkable to some people, because I think there's this association of creativity with being progressive, and I think perhaps that's because progressives tend to associate creativity as being a good thing, and they naturally want to associate any good thing with their own side of the house. But I think firstly, I think in terms of mass media, I think most conservatives have generally thought about it as being a business.
Yeah.
Which of course it is. And in terms of in terms of the theatre and in terms of opera, I think there are conservative audiences that didn't necessarily feel the need to see their own views about the world reflected back at them in their art. Although I think in many ways it's subliminally, I mean, certainly in a lot of cinema, I think you can find not necessarily recent stuff, but traditionally, I think you saw some sort of basic conservative, particularly in American cinema, values reflected back at them. But I don't think
if you look at the Western,
I
mean that's an incredibly conservative art form right the way through.
But also, even in sort of more recently, in your typical 1980s or 1990s family movie, the sort of the schmaltzy American family movie, it was generally a pretty conservative arena. I think what's changed in recent years is that variety of worldview that you saw in these circles, you had actors who had a variety of ways of thinking about the world, just as you had lawyers with a variety of ways of thinking about the world, or civil servants with a variety of ways of thinking about the world. I think in recent decades, you've seen that change, and there's been this.
Yeah.
And
I
think
you're not really getting the Reagans and the Eastwoods and people like that.
Although, I mean, I think
probably American cinema is a bit different.
American cinema is a bit different. But I think there's this difference about audiences not insisting on seeing their own in things like the opera, not insisting on seeing their own values reflected back at them. But I think what happens then is that it becomes less about the audience and more about the creators and the writers and the performers who. And I felt that there was a moment in 2016 and in the aftermath where, before that I did used to go to the theatre and things like that, and I just stopped for a couple of years because it felt like there was this lecture at the end of every performance, and there was something. And I think that's something. I think that a lot of conservatives would have just, and I don't know whether your experience, whether I think a lot of conservatives just sort of quietly exited the arena.
Yeah, so I've since I've lived on my own, I've never owned a TV. And actually, I stopped watching TV about then. And I'm not sure it was a particularly political act. I think I'd just become a man and wanted to put away childish things. And television was one of them. But I do remember watching classic things like Have I Got News for You? And just thinking, oh my God, I can't do this again. I can't do this again. And I think it was that bad, it put me off the entire format. And I remember stopping listening to a lot of Radio 4 shows in that period as well, because they just became unlistenable. But you mentioned about the creators. I think it's interesting that we used to have people like, you mentioned him earlier, Kenneth Clarke, and also Alan Clarke. I watched an Alan Clarke documentary on YouTube the other day on the history of the Tory party. And the idea of those kind of, I mean, I can't even say non-party political conservatives, but those innately deeply conservative figures coming through and making television as creators, I think is almost unthinkable now.
Kenneth Clarke, the father, was I believe, a social democrat. He was a man of the centre left. But his son, obviously famous.
But he had a very small C view of civilization, small C conservative view of civilization, I would say.
Well, yeah, I think
certainly in the context of the debate we've just been having about the kind of ideals.
But I think this is the interesting factor, is that you got a pair like those two, father and son, who had these differences of opinion and different. Obviously, I think somebody like Kenneth Clarke, because of his generation, he was constantly looking back over his shoulder at the communists, and which he, to some extent, you almost by definition became a small c conservative by not being a communist, a man of that era. And that was what he was alluding to when he said, I am myself as a stick in the mud. I think later generations, perhaps sort of people born around the time of the Second World War, had that moment of freedom in later decades where they could talk more openly, and there was this ambivalence, and they saw that communism had vanished as this cultural enemy. And I think, though, obviously, there was the moment in the 1950s, especially in America, where people really saw the culture as being this vector for communist influence, and people were genuinely exercised about it. And perhaps I think the disappearance of communism as this existential threat made a lot of conservatives very ambivalent about the need, and that there was a sort of almost lackadaisical, the battle's won now and we don't need to worry too much about it, not seeing this sort of leaden progressivism emerging as I think they've only very recently even noticed it as that kind of a threat. But I find that political disagreements between generations, I think in a more modern era, that would be a mark of a conflict. There wouldn't be that sort of easygoing acceptance of being on different.
It'd be something to write a tiresome left-wing play about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or, obviously Alan Clarke wouldn't have done that, but.
What a ridiculous, an incredibly controversial note in his diary.
But I think that there is. I think the attitude that a lot of conservatives instinctively have in terms of these contested public spaces and in terms of the theatre and things like that is that it's almost as if the instinctive pose was one of apology, and they just step away rather than, which progressives aren't going to do. And I think that they have always seen culture as being the primary the arena of battle
as a tool of social change. I think that's absolutely true. And I think one of the real problems that we're having at the minute is that because conservatives have stepped away, the radical left, progressives, call them what you will, have basically done that march through the institutions, and the right has constantly, every advance they have just meekly absorbed under the rubric of neutrality. And I think if we are going to renew culture from the right, I think one of the things we have to do is basically abandon, sounds awful, abandon the idea of the free marketplace of ideas and the invisible hand of the market is guiding culture, because they just don't. That's not how culture works. I mean, all art has always been elite backed from before the Renaissance. It's always been elite backed. But most arts funding and most culture funding in the UK now is state backed. So, the moment you kind of essentially give up the field with claims of, the small state, you've basically surrendered the battlefield, and the battlefield is the institution. And I think a great example of this is the Arts Council, which I think provides something like, it's about 500,000, 500 million.
Half a billion.
Joking. It's 500 million quid every year, 80% of which comes from taxpayers. And that has been now completely captured by progressives. I mean, I've got some examples that are absolutely horrific, but artistic merit is now nowhere near. State funding is almost never given for artistic merit alone.
But to what extent do you think that? I mean, I think that the left has accrued a huge amount of political advantage, social and political advantage, through its sort of command of these cultural institutions generally, and the general vibe of the cultural sphere. But do you not think that there's an argument that, I mean, organisations like the Arts Fund, the Arts Council, and there's various imitations of it in the Design Council and things like that. Do you not think that by giving this funding out the way that they do, they reduce the need for art to seek popular approval, and they contribute toward this elitism that actually that's the Achilles? Well, I don't think it's an Achilles heel, but it's certainly a weakness that a lot of the art that they produce it appears ridiculous, and it's sort of something to. And I think I don't think that the conservative instinct to point and laugh at a lot of it does us any good, but equally, I don't think that it necessarily does them any good either to simply create content, whether that's visual, whether that's dramatic, that's just for their mates.
I don't know, because I suppose my argument would be it doesn't need to have mass appeal because it's taxpayer funded. So it doesn't matter if nobody goes through the doors of your museum. Or, I mean, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter if you are not having mass popular impact, because actually it is your mates who matter, because they're the ones who are writing in the newspapers, and they're the ones who are writing for the magazines, and they're the ones who are doing a review of your new gallery opening for some taxpayer funded like arts publication. So I don't think they really need to make mass market media. They need to kind of curate elite taste, and that's what they're doing really, really well. And it is completely in hoc to progressive goals. I mean, I think I read about the Fitzwilliam Museum in Oxford a long time ago, which I wrote about it because they'd put warnings on paintings by Constable that warned people that they could basically these pictures of a bucolic in England could create nationalist feelings. And they've done that because the Arts Council basically says that museums who receive Arts Council funding, like the Fitzwilliam, have to make the creative case for diversity, and they have to create, I think it's marginalised, they have to cater to marginalised audiences via marginalised artists. So, it's been completely given over. And it's not the only one. I mean, the examples are countless. I went into Manchester Art Gallery a few years ago. I think one of the first pieces I ever wrote for the Critic, and it was just, there was a piece of art attacking Priti Patel, who was then Home Secretary, for one of the rare occasions where she actually enforced the border. There was like a picture of a house in some Manchester estate that was being redeveloped, and you might have thought that was an opportunity to tell a story of something about Manchester, and actually that it was about Syrian migration.
Is there not, though? I think for its own sake, it would obviously be enormously beneficial to the soul and to the nation and for everything if we were able to walk around our museums without being taunted in that way by such nonsense. And I think that surely it must be damaging for sort of generations of children going around it for the first time that don't remember what it was like before. But is there not an extent, and I think I'm almost putting this as devil's advocate, because I think that this will be the way that a lot of people on the right generally will think about it, is this not politically self-defeating by the left? I mean, things like, obvious examples of just absurdity like that, and it really does reveal this sort of hatred. Some people describe it as self-hatred. I don't think it's self-hatred. I think they hate the rest of us. But examples like that of just such errant overreach, surely that's going to do the left politically and culturally more damage in the long run. And to an extent, if we're sort of thinking about, well, do we want to try and it wouldn't just be the Arts Council, it would be every sort of funding distributor below them.
Gotcha.
If we're not going to try and repurpose or recreate that infrastructure for our own benefit, we surely want to take a step back and say, well, we don't want to end up like that, sort of putting our own stuff all over everything. And
yeah, I think politically it does matter, right? Because you and I can just about remember a before all this. But if you are now a child or you've got kids, they are constantly exposed to this stuff, and they are, culture is like a water for a fish, right? You're swimming in, you don't even notice it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for children and the next generation, I think having them just absorb this stuff and saying, well, it doesn't matter because it's all ridiculous. A child doesn't know that. And so it's more of a problem for the next generation, I think, than for us. And there is an argument that actually you're seeing in the latest generations, they are going rightwards because the dominant culture is left. And I suppose that's a more accurate argument. But I think you're right. I don't think if we're going to renew culture for the right, I don't think we have to take.
So I suppose my question would be, should the right seek to not emulate, but to at least try and match the left in terms of its institutional power within the arts world, and particularly in terms of things like funding? Or should we seek to enforce our position would be the enforcement of this kind of neutrality, and that you try and keep it out. Now, I suppose that there's a risk there that all you're doing is sort of trying to insist that the pendulum stops in the middle, because at some point you're going to lose that power, and the other people are going to be committed to making it swing the other way. My
answer would be anti-woke McCarthyism.
Yeah.
That's what we need. And the thing about McCarthy is, of course, he was right, and actually, if anything, massively underestimated the scale of communist influence. I fundamentally, I do think we need like a program of anti-woke McCarthyism, right? I don't think we need to destroy these cultural institutions or even the funding institutions. That I think would be largely monstrous. But what you do need to do is you do actually need to fight for those institutions in order to enforce their strict neutrality, because neutrality of these institutions, strict neutrality, we'd all be happy with. We're all quite happy with ENO, the English National Opera and art galleries getting funding for, the goals of the institutions and producing operas and putting on artworks. The problem that the right has is when they are used for expressly political goals.
I think the battle that we'd have on our hands initially is even defining what neutrality meant.
Yeah,
I think going back to the example of McCarthyism, the communists the communists of 1950s America knew that they were communists. I don't think that a lot of people in the arts world, I think especially the really woke ones, I don't think they know they're woke. I think that they genuinely believe that wokeness is a right-wing hobgoblin.
I think that's true.
I think that we'd have such, and possibly that indicates the extent to which conservatives have surrendered these spaces, in that we need to define what it we need to define what it was, and perhaps that would be. But I think you're fundamentally, at the end of the day, left with the same issue that we've got in terms of the judiciary or in terms of the civil service.
Oh, yeah.
That you've got a personnel problem. It's not as if there is this sort of cadre of apolitical people coming in to go into sculpture or into... Well, to be honest, I suspect there might be more than in things like opera, people who just want to sing.
Yes. I suspect there are more in sculpture than you think. People who, just want to go and make art, or, there was a recent gallery show, wasn't there? They were right-wing artists, but I think they prided themselves on being not left-wing, and they did right-wing. And I think you are. The problem is, as I said earlier, all art is elite backed, and you do need a kind of elite backing. But in Britain, that's infinitesimal compared to the state. But I think if they don't know the people deciding this money, if they don't know their work, well, that's our job to tell them, really, isn't it? And get rid of them while we're at it.
And I wonder whether there's, in terms of reorienting creating spaces for more traditional. I mean, sculpture's the obvious. Well, it's an obvious one where there are people that would love to create these sort of wonderful things. I mean, it's almost in danger of becoming lost because there's far more abstract.
Yeah.
Well, but I know that I'm in danger here of sort of becoming the man ranting at modern art in a gallery. But even a return to modern art would be I think would be sort of quite a bold and subversive thing to do compared to this sort of.
Yeah, maybe figurative is a step too far, but literal would be nice, rather than, painting feelings and things like this kind of Californian pseudo psychobabble that now passes for art. I'll be the one who rants at art. That's fine.
And I don't know. I think it comes back. I go back to this point about personnel and how do we start to. I think that there's an awful lot of people. If you look at going back to mass forms like television, for example, if you look at go and have a look at sort of actors that appeared in things like Coronation Street in the 1960s, or people from the earlier days of film, especially in Britain, and go and look at their Wikipedia pages, go and look at their backstory, and these are often people who came from decidedly small town, basically working class backgrounds. And they often, again with parental pressure, but often it was simply an old going to the local theatre and becoming an understudy. It was sort of an alternative to going and working in a factory.
Yeah.
And there was enough, and it goes back to one of my favourite little subjects about this sort of common culture and this working class common culture of spaces where entertainment was part of that lifestyle.
Yeah.
Whether it was playing the piano in the pub, and there were back in those days, you would have found people in the average sort of boozer in a small town. Somebody would have been able to play the piano. They wouldn't have read music, but they could do it.
Yeah.
That's sort of almost vanished to some extent. And if we look at modern Britain, obviously, got an awful lot of people going to university, but still about 50% of people don't, and they tend to go into the trades, into even jobs like sales now are almost sort of defined for university graduates. But I think that an awful lot of those people who don't go to university include the kind of people who in earlier times might have gone into the world of arts or entertainment. But now because in those days those were kind of disreputable things to go into.
Yeah.
Now the visual and performing arts are the absolute apogee of status.
Yeah.
It is the hub to become a successful artist or a good actor. It's absolutely the most sort of successful thing you can be seen to do. And as such, it's reserved for people of a far more higher status background who, as we've seen over the last few decades, have become a lot more orthodox in terms of or unvaried in terms of the way they see the world.
I don't think that's just a status game. I think you're right, it is in part a status game. I actually think another reason that those people are not going in is because of the existence of mass media. Because of the sudden existence of things like radio and television, basically that has killed what you might call the participatory culture. Mm-hmm. So people who would, go and play the piano in a pub to entertain people, you don't need that anymore because you have the radio and you have pop music and it's all outsourced. And so you don't have to form that participatory culture. Mm-hmm. And I think you see that in very early concerns about things like the radio. People were worried that it would that people would just be sat there mindlessly sitting around the radio. You also see it in very early concerns about things like the newspapers, because it would stop people, getting around together and talking. And essentially, To take the long view, all those concerns were broadly pretty right, because now that participatory culture has completely
Yeah, and
drawn away.
I see it to some extent. There's a wonderful vox pop that occasionally does the rounds in from the BBC archive from the mid 1970s. Of it's a lady who's clearly been asked about the impact of television on family life, and she delivers this wonderful 5-minute long monologue about the way that her family. Clearly, it was sort of. This was a family that would have had television for 6 or 7 years by that point.
Yeah.
And the way that she talks is she comes across a great deal like Kenneth Williams. And you can imagine a young Kenneth Williams being surrounded by that kind of woman. But the one point she says, well, people say that it's destroyed the art of conversation. She says, well, I can't imagine what we talked about before. But it talks about people there around sort of in the queue for the bus, nowadays would be sort of around the water cooler at work, talking about what they saw on the telly last night.
Yeah.
And that, I think we've really seen that element of the common culture back off in the last few years, where we don't, and I suppose people of roughly our age, we're not quite the same age, but we're the last bunch of people who can remember all sitting and watching the same programmes. And you went to school the following day, and I don't know. Actually, are you too young for that?
No, it was Walking with Dinosaurs. That was about the last thing I can remember. But I was never a particularly big television watcher. My mother only let me watch 1 hour per day to stop it frying my brain, and my brain is still fried because she couldn't possibly predicted the internet. But that's not her fault.
No, Walking with, and that was again. But yeah, I think you're right in that in terms of one of the last seminal moments.
And now all these things, I suppose, have been hived off into different streaming platforms where you're pumped various different forms of agit slop right into your room.
Yeah,
things like Adolescence,
but they can pump. But does that potentially give conservatives an opening as we're sort of trying to get our foot back in the door? The fact that audiences are so fragmented now, that there is the space to start small and work out big, or did we really need, for it to work, did we really need everybody sat down together looking at the same thing?
I think it does offer an opening. I think probably not as big as if, obviously, you were getting people together in a single room and all watching a single program. But the problem with that is, again, because conservatives, and not even conservatives, but non-liberal progressives are almost completely shut out of the art world, the stuff they produce is largely, at best, third tier. And so you come out with these, conservative media products are invariably absolutely, on the whole, dreadful, obviously, apart from this podcast, which is fantastic. But on the whole, they are really substandard because you're not getting a through flow of talent through the institutions. You're not getting, sculptors who know how to sculpt. You're not even getting, people who, people through journalism schools or things like that. And that really has a massive cost for the end product, which is then invariably second standard.
To what extent do you think the public are aware of this? I mean, do you think there's a sense that people are noticing things changing? For example, looking just at things like Lord of the Rings, for example. Now, I think that it was almost perfectly timed in terms of when it was made, sort of in terms of where the technology was to actually create the visual imagery.
Yeah.
But also, as we've seen, if they'd tried to do that a few years later, you would have seen the kind of politics being shoehorned in. But
they did. They did with the Rings of Power, right?
Exactly.
The Amazon remake.
But that's obviously at a what was it, nearly 20 odd year remove.
Yeah.
Is there a public awareness, do you think, of the extent to which the arts just, I think if you'd ask the average person how regularly they go to the cinema now compared to how regularly they used to go.
Oh God, it must be tiny. And particularly so for things like theatres, museums, operas, ballets. Opera and ballet has had very small viewership for most of our lifetimes, actually. So it's not probably, gone through a
If
precipitous
anything, opera
decline.
probably is one of the, in terms of the viewing over time, I think probably one of the healthier in terms of keeping a steady number.
Yeah, and certainly in terms of comparison to the baseline, I think ballet probably is as well. But yeah, I think there is an awareness, and I think it's not necessarily the arts in particular, but I think there is an awareness that this kind of stuff is floating around in the culture. I mean, a great example is Sarah Pochin. Is it Pochin? I'm not the
Reform MP. I don't know.
No, neither do I. We should
say
probably
Pachin.
Yeah,
Sarah Pachin.
Sarah Pachin.
Yeah.
Sweet Pachin from Island Green, distilled from wheat and rye. So she made a comment a while back that was, I think it was badly worded, about the overrepresentation of black and ethnic minority people in adverts. But that is a very common concern. It's not even a concern.
It's something that people have noticed.
It's something that people have noticed. My parents have noticed that, and they consistently point it out. And it's come up in random conversations that I've had with other people. So I think people are aware, but probably the consumption of media is so thin now that it doesn't really come through, because we're not having a single conversation about anything.
Yeah, and I remember when that debate bubble, and it was something that I was aware of, but honestly, I had to go back and check because of how little I expose myself to adverts these days. I think an awful lot of people, and actually the people that really do still rely on the television for their news, for entertainment, for everything, are now older people.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny that particular phenomenon, and obviously there was the sound and fury about it, but then sort of there was hard data to back it up. It's true.
Yeah.
There's the argument sort of saying, well, advertisers want to sell to everybody, including people of all races, so everybody's going to put people of different races in their adverts, and obviously that's going to mean that you get a far more skewed impression than reality. And I'd sort of go back and say, well, that's not quite the case, because there's things that you don't see in adverts that you do see in reality, and that they're clearly monkeying around with it for some. There's clearly something deeper going on, but there's this resistance of talking about it.
Go on then. What's the something deeper?
No, I think that it's the same. I think that people worry about tropes. People worry about depicting people in certain in certain circumstances. I think that I'm prevaricating here, aren't I?
Yes, you are.
I am.
You're talking about people. You're talking about advertisers, for instance, not wanting to put black men as I'm thinking of all the adverts on the tube for sexual assault.
Oh yeah,
they don't want to use
stuff like that. Stuff like that. I think is that's quite overt, and I'm quite happy to say that. I think that is politically motivated. I think that they skew in terms of they're very fond of depicting mixed race relationships, for example, which are common enough. But for example, you'll see a huge skew away from relationships with, for example, a black man and a white woman. You'll see that very rarely in advertising. You see an awful lot more of relationships with a black woman and a white man, which is in practice, in reality, far rarer than the other way around. So I think that just saying that people, if it was random, I think you'd see less of that.
Yeah.
And I think that people are trying to, but I think there's deeper stuff there about what they're trying to achieve, and I don't necessarily think it's entirely politically motivated. I think that there's a skew in terms of what the sort of people who work in advertising see, because they tend to come from a far more metropolitan.
I was literally about to say it's a London bias.
Yeah, I think essentially.
If you compare the representation of people in adverts to the population as a whole, it's very, 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 very out of whack. If you compare it to the population of London, it is significantly less so.
Out of whack, yeah.
And so I think they are just basically, what's that? You write what you know.
No, and I think that there's a lot of truth to that, but also, I mean, there is some truth to the argument that advertising is designed, it happens individual ad by individual ad, so that they can't individually, they're not responsible for sort of the overall composition of adverts sort of across the board. But I think it was interesting, the response to Sarah Puccin's comments, in that there really seemed to be this aversion to the idea that anybody would want to talk about it, even though I think it followed that I think statistics have been published and have been commented on quite widely in the media the week or so before about it. And I think, again, it comes down to this: what is acceptable to say, and what do these people feel comfortable talking about, given that the sort of people that they're working around every day, and it's just not spoken about in those circles, where I think if there was a bit more variety and a bit more of a mix in terms of who was actually in these places, and it comes down again to the same personnel issue that we've got across the board.
Yeah. But if you want variety, why not subscribe to The Critic? Thank you for joining us.